At some point, you notice it. Not just that you're thinking, but that you're thinking the same way again. The same patterns, the same ideas, the same loops repeating themselves, almost like your mind is going in circles without reaching anything new. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like repetition. Like you've been here before, thinking the same thoughts, asking the same questions, going over the same possibilities. And even when you recognize it, even when you know exactly what's happening, it doesn't stop. That's what makes it frustrating. It's not just that your mind is active, it's that it's stuck. It keeps returning to the same place, replaying the same sequence, as if it's trying to solve something but never actually finishes. And no matter how many times you go through it, it feels just as convincing, just as real, just as important, which makes it difficult to step away from, because it doesn't feel like something random. It feels like something that needs to be figured out, but if it keeps repeating without changing, what is it actually doing? And more importantly, why does it keep happening? Your brain is built to recognize patterns and return to them. When something stands out, something feels unresolved, something seems important, your mind marks it. It keeps it available, ready to come back to, ready to process again. That's useful when something actually needs attention. But the system doesn't always distinguish between what is useful and what is simply familiar. If a thought has been repeated enough, it becomes easier to access, easier to return to, easier to continue. And once that happens, your brain starts favoring that path. Not because it's helpful, but because it's available. It's a known route, a pattern that has already been used, so it becomes the default. So instead of moving forward, your mind circles back. It follows the same path again, not because it needs to, but because that path is already there. And that's how a loop forms. Not through intention, but through repetition and familiarity. What keeps the loop active is the feeling that something is unfinished, that there is still something to figure out, something to resolve, something that hasn't been fully understood. That sense of incompleteness pulls your attention back in, because your brain doesn't like open loops. It prefers closure. It wants a clear answer, a clear outcome, something that feels complete. And when it doesn't get that, it keeps trying. So the thought returns. You go through it again, trying to see it differently, trying to reach a conclusion that feels final. But if the thought itself doesn't lead to resolution, the process repeats. And each repetition reinforces the idea that the answer is still there, just not found yet. So your brain keeps searching, keeps revisiting, keeps looping through the same sequence. And that search makes the loop feel necessary, even when it's not leading anywhere new. Another reason the loop feels so strong is because of how familiar it becomes. The more often a thought repeats, the more natural it feels. It starts to feel like part of your normal thinking, something that belongs, something that fits, and that familiarity lowers resistance. You don't question it as much. You don't see it as something new or separate. It feels like something that has always been there. But that familiarity is also what keeps the loop going, because what feels familiar is easier to return to. It doesn't require effort. It doesn't require adjustment. Your brain already knows how to follow that path, so it uses it again and again and again, and each time the loop becomes stronger, not because it's useful, but because it's repeated. And repetition is what turns a thought into a pattern. What makes the loop so difficult to break is that it doesn't feel like repetition while you're inside it. Each time the thought returns, it feels slightly different. A new angle, a new detail, a new way of looking at the same thing. And that small variation creates the illusion of progress. It feels like you're getting closer to something, like this time might be different, like this version of the thought might lead somewhere new, and that feeling keeps you engaged. But underneath those small changes, the structure stays the same. The thought follows the same path, leads to the same conclusions, returns to the same starting point. The variation doesn't change the outcome. It only makes the loop less obvious. So instead of recognizing it as repetition, your brain treats it as continuation. It keeps moving forward even though it's circling back. And because it feels like progress, it becomes much harder to step out of. You don't see it as a loop. You see it as something that is still unfolding, even when it's not going anywhere new. There is also a strong connection between loops and attention. The more attention a thought receives, the more active it becomes. And the more active it becomes, the more likely it is to return. Attention acts like reinforcement. It tells your brain that this thought matters, that it should be kept available, that it should be easy to access again. And your brain responds by strengthening that pathway. So the next time there is space in your mind, that thought is one of the first to appear. Not because it is important, but because it has been reinforced. And once it appears, the cycle repeats. You notice it, you engage with it, you follow it, and that engagement strengthens it even further. This is how loops maintain themselves, not through force, but through repetition and attention working together. The thought stays active because it keeps being used. Another factor that keeps the loop going is how convincing it feels every time it returns. Even if you've thought about it before, even if you've gone through it multiple times, it still feels real in the moment. That's because each time the thought appears, it brings the same emotional tone with it, the same sense of importance, the same urgency, the same feeling that this needs to be understood. And that feeling resets the experience. It doesn't matter that you've seen it before. It feels relevant. It feels like something happening right now, so you engage with it again as if it's new, and that engagement keeps the loop alive. This is why loops don't fade on their own, because each repetition feels fresh enough to be taken seriously, even when nothing has changed. Over time, the loop becomes something your brain expects. It becomes part of your default thinking pattern, something that runs automatically when there is nothing else taking your attention. And because it is expected, it doesn't feel out of place. It feels normal. It feels like something that is just part of how your mind works. But that expectation is what keeps it going, because when your brain anticipates a pattern, it prepares for it. It makes it easier to access, easier to continue, easier to fall back into. So even when you're not actively thinking about it, the conditions are already set for the loop to return. It doesn't need a strong trigger. It only needs a moment of space. And once it appears, the process starts again. Not because you chose it, but because the system is ready to run it. And that readiness is what makes the loop feel constant. If you look closely at how the loop unfolds, you'll notice that it doesn't actually move forward in the way it feels. It creates the sensation of progress, but structurally, it returns to the same points again and again. The same questions, the same interpretations, the same unresolved pieces repeating in slightly different forms. That repetition is subtle enough to avoid immediate recognition. It feels like variation instead of duplication. But if you trace it back, each path leads to the same place. The thought doesn't expand into something new. It cycles through what is already known. And because it feels like something is happening, your brain stays engaged. It doesn't recognize the loop as closed. It treats it as something still in motion. This creates the illusion that you're getting somewhere, even when the structure hasn't changed. And that illusion is what keeps the loop active, because as long as it feels like progress, there is no reason to stop. Your attention plays a central role in maintaining this illusion. The longer you stay focused on the loop, the more detailed it becomes. And that detail makes it feel deeper, more complex, more meaningful. At first, the thought might be simple, but as your attention stays with it, your brain starts adding layers. It builds scenarios, explores possibilities, connects it to past experiences, and all of that creates a sense of depth. That depth feels like progress. It feels like you're understanding something more clearly, like you're uncovering something important. And that keeps your attention locked in. But the depth is being generated in real time. It's not something that was already there. It's something your brain is creating as you engage with it. And because it feels substantial, it becomes harder to step away. The loop feels important, even when it is simply being expanded by your attention. There is also a strong pull toward resolution that keeps you inside the loop. Your brain expects that if you think about something long enough, you will eventually reach an answer. That expectation keeps the process going. But not all thoughts lead to resolution. Some are based on uncertainty, interpretation, or possibilities that don't have a clear outcome, and when those thoughts are repeated, they don't move toward a conclusion. They circle around the same uncertainty. This creates a gap between expectation and reality. Your brain expects closure, but the thought doesn't provide it. And instead of stopping, your mind continues, trying to reach a conclusion that may not exist. That continued effort reinforces the loop. Each attempt to resolve the thought leads back into the same structure, the same uncertainty, the same pattern. And because the resolution never arrives, the loop never feels complete. At this point, the loop starts to feel automatic in a way that is difficult to interrupt. It doesn't feel like something you're choosing to continue. It feels like something that is continuing on its own, pulling your attention back each time it appears. And when you try to step away, the loop doesn't disappear. It lingers in the background, ready to return as soon as your focus shifts. It remains active, even when you're not fully engaged with it. This persistence makes it feel constant, like it's always there, waiting, ready to restart at any moment. And that creates the sense that you're stuck, not just temporarily, but continuously. Because even when you leave the loop, it feels like it hasn't left you. And that feeling is what makes it so difficult to fully step out of it. One of the reasons the loop feels so persistent is because your brain doesn't recognize repetition as something to stop. It recognizes it as something to continue. If a thought has been revisited multiple times, your brain interprets that as a signal that it is important, that it requires attention, that it has not yet been resolved. So instead of reducing its presence, your brain increases it. It keeps the thought active, keeps it accessible, keeps it ready to return. And each time it comes back, it feels justified because it has been revisited before. This creates a cycle where repetition reinforces importance, and importance justifies repetition. The more it loops, the more it feels like it needs to loop. And because this process is automatic, it doesn't feel like something that can be turned off. It feels like something that has its own momentum, its own direction, its own reason for continuing. But that momentum is not coming from the thought itself. It's coming from how your brain has learned to treat it. And that distinction is what begins to change how the loop is understood. There is also a familiarity effect that makes the loop feel almost comfortable, even when it's frustrating. The thought pattern becomes something your brain recognizes easily. It doesn't require effort to enter it. It's already mapped out, already structured, already available. And because of that, your mind can return to it without resistance. It feels like a known space, something predictable, something that doesn't require adjustment. Even if it's not helpful, it is familiar. That familiarity lowers awareness. You don't notice the loop forming in the same way because it feels like something you've already experienced. It blends into your normal thinking process. And that makes it harder to interrupt. Because you're not stepping into something new, you're stepping into something that already feels like part of you. And that sense of familiarity is what allows the loop to continue without being questioned as often as it should be. Another layer comes from how your brain treats unresolved thoughts as unfinished tasks. When something feels incomplete, your mind holds onto it. It keeps it active in the background, ready to return to it when there is space. But in loops, the sense of incompleteness never changes. The thought doesn't progress toward resolution, so it remains open. And because it remains open, your brain continues to revisit it. Each return feels like another attempt to complete something that hasn't been finished yet, and that repeated attempt reinforces the idea that completion is still possible, even if it never actually happens. This creates a cycle where the thought remains active, not because it is useful, but because it is unresolved, and the lack of resolution keeps the system engaged. So the loop continues not toward an answer, but toward the feeling that an answer should exist. What begins to shift this pattern is recognizing that the loop is not being driven by new information. It is being sustained by repetition, the same structure, the same ideas, the same interpretations being revisited again and again. When that becomes clear, the sense of progress starts to change. The loop no longer feels like something that is moving forward. It begins to feel like something that is repeating, and that recognition creates distance. It separates you from the process. It allows you to see the pattern instead of being fully inside it. And when you can see the pattern, the automatic nature of the loop starts to weaken. It doesn't pull you in as easily because it no longer feels like something new, it feels like something you've already seen. And that familiarity, when recognized, begins to work against the loop instead of reinforcing it. As that awareness builds, the loop begins to lose some of its intensity. The thoughts still appear, but they don't feel as compelling. They don't carry the same urgency, the same pressure to be followed, the same sense that something needs to be resolved immediately. Because without that urgency, the loop doesn't sustain itself in the same way. It requires engagement to continue, and when that engagement is reduced, even slightly, the loop begins to slow. This doesn't stop the thoughts from appearing, but it changes how they behave once they do. They don't expand as quickly. They don't connect into long chains as easily. They remain more contained. And that containment is what begins to break the cycle, not by removing thoughts, but by preventing them from turning into continuous repetition. And that shift changes the experience of being inside the loop. This doesn't mean the loop disappears immediately. The patterns that created it have been reinforced over time, and they take time to change. But the experience of the loop begins to shift. It becomes more noticeable, more defined, less automatic. You start to see when it begins, how it builds, how it repeats, and that visibility changes how you respond to it. Because when something is visible, it is easier to step away from. It no longer feels like something you are fully inside. It feels like something you are observing as it happens, and that observation creates space, a small gap between the thought and your response to it, and that gap is what allows the loop to begin losing its strength. What this ultimately reveals is that the loop is not something fixed. It is something that is maintained through interaction, through attention, repetition, and the expectation that it will lead somewhere. When those elements change, the loop changes. It becomes less stable, less continuous, less automatic. It doesn't disappear all at once, but it begins to weaken. And as it weakens, your experience of your mind changes with it. It feels less repetitive, less stuck, less confined to the same patterns, not because the system has been turned off, but because it is no longer being reinforced in the same way. And that change is what makes it possible to move out of the loop over time. And once that becomes clear, the idea of being stuck begins to shift. It no longer feels like something permanent, something that cannot be changed. It becomes something that is part of a process, something that can be understood, something that can be influenced. The loop may still appear, but it doesn't carry the same sense of control. It doesn't feel like something you are trapped inside. It feels like something that is happening, but not something that has to continue. And that difference changes everything, because it removes the sense of inevitability. It shows that the loop is not something that exists on its own, but something that depends on how it is engaged with. And when that engagement changes, the loop changes with it. And that is where the sense of being stuck begins to loosen, and something different becomes possible. One final detail that makes the loop feel so inescapable is how quickly it reactivates after it fades. Even when there is a moment of quiet, even when your attention shifts away briefly, the same thought pattern can return almost instantly. And when it does, it doesn't feel like a continuation that was paused. It feels like it has started again. That restart creates the impression that nothing has changed, that the loop is still active, still ongoing, still controlling your attention. But what's actually happening is that the pattern has been triggered again, not that it never stopped. And that distinction matters. Because if it feels like it never stopped, it feels permanent. It feels like something you're trapped inside without interruption. But if it is restarting, it means there was a gap, even if it was brief. And those gaps are where the pattern loses continuity. They show that the loop is not a single unbroken process, but a series of repeated activations that feel connected because they are similar. Once you begin to notice those gaps, even slightly, the experience changes. The loop no longer feels endless. It feels repetitive, and repetition, unlike something continuous, can be interrupted. not by force, but by recognizing that each return is a new instance, not a continuation that cannot be stopped.